Tens of millions of Americans depend on food assistance and other social programs to feed their families and make ends meet. And yet, state budgets, which we know are under a lot of strain these days, don't always set aside much money to help people stay up to date on all the paperwork the government requires for them to keep those benefits coming. So people wind up getting kicked off for no other reason than they just didn't know. This is a big problem for the families who suddenly can't afford food, and also for states that have to spend time and millions of dollars signing them back up. If you're thinking to yourself, there has got to be a better way, well, in fact, there is. Bloomberg Businessweek contributor Wes Kosova is here with the story of a nonprofit called Code for America. It works with states to make navigating these benefit programs less of a hassle.
Anything that can get rid of some of those frictions is something that they're trying to eliminate, so it's just an easy process.
And a little later, Code for America's Genevieve Miller talks about the challenge of marrying new digital tools to old analog bureaucracies.
We're working to transform the social safety net by using human-centered technology to remove barriers to public benefits.
I'm Wes Kosova. Today on The Big Take, they're from the government, and they're here to help. Bryce, tell us about Code for America. What does it do?
It's a nonprofit, and their mission is basically to help state governments make it easier for people to get the benefits that they're already eligible for. Just because you might be eligible for food stamps or for Medicaid doesn't mean it's an easy process to get it or to hold on to it in a lot of places. And so they are focused on working on the tech side of things so that when you go to apply, when you go to renew, it's a smoother process. It works on your cell phone. It's translated into whatever your native language is, and then you're able to actually get the assistance that you deserve to help you survive.
And so people who aren't on public assistance probably don't know that there's just an endless amount that you have to do to keep it up. You have to reapply. You have to hit deadlines. There's a lot of paperwork. You imagine the government bureaucracy. And so this is aimed at just making that a whole lot easier?
Yeah, I think their ideal is that the process takes you maybe 10 minutes. And for most people where the norm is operating, it can be hours of paperwork. And they do that by putting things online. They do that by making the language easier to understand. A lot of these forms are in very technical, jargony language that's really hard to decipher. Again, they translate it into Spanish or to even other languages. They make it mobile friendly. They make it so that maybe you don't even need a password. You could use a PIN because a lot of people struggle with having an email address or a password. Anything that can get rid of some of those frictions is something that they're trying to eliminate. So it's just an easy process.
And so they are not a government organization. What they do is they try to get governments to work with them.
Right. They're a nonprofit, and what they do is they partner with the governments, and they are very much about working together. Basically, the landscape sort of pre-Code for America is that there are a bunch of vendors that specialize in these benefit delivery technology services. And the vendor will be hired to, say, build a website where you can apply for SNAP. But then the vendor goes off and sort of does all the work, delivers his product, and then the state government, hands it over and says, okay, people come apply. And if they want to update it, they have to go back to the vendor and say, hey, can you change this little thing? And then the vendor has to go through the process. And so it's very hard to update technology. And it means that the state government employees don't have ownership over it, maybe don't understand the systems that they're working with. Code for America is very much about coming in and learning from the state government employees, learning also from the people who use these systems themselves to understand how they work, how they don't work, and then working with everyone in a really collaborative way. And ultimately, every project they aim to hand over completely to the state government so that they can keep building on it and they can just fully own it and use it for whatever purposes they think are the right purposes.
So you got to watch them in action as they were trying to put together a program in a state. How did that work? Can you just tell us, what do they do when they contract with a state to provide their services?
Sure. So I got to watch and sort of ride along as they were helping the state of Connecticut in their SNAP program, their food benefit program specifically, roll out texting for the first time. And the first pilot, which is basically the part of it that I got to see, was just to text people when it was time to renew their benefits so that they didn't forget. And the text would also include a link to the website where they can renew to try to urge them to do it online.
So in Connecticut, how does it work? You get SNAP benefits and sort of like what happens?
So you enroll the first time, and then every 6 months or so, unless you are in an exempt category, you have to renew in order to keep your benefits, which means that the paperwork is lighter, but you still have to do it on a regular basis, basically to tell the state whether your income has changed or you have a kid at home or maybe a kid left. And a lot of people actually lose their benefits at that point. Nationally, there is a lot of what's called churn when people have to renew and reapply. And it's not because they're not eligible. It's because they get tripped up by the paperwork, the deadlines, all of that.
If somebody is kicked off the rolls, are people going for long periods of time without being able to buy food?
It depends on, first of all, just the process the state has already set up. You know, how long is the paperwork and how long is the approval process? And that's going to vary a lot. And then it also just sort of depends on how quickly are you able to get it together to get that paperwork done again. You know, I spoke to a woman in Connecticut who has to get doctor's notes for her SNAP and her cash welfare renewal forms, and she doesn't have a car, and it's hours on a bus to go see those doctors and then get them to fax it in, and they don't always fax it in time. And so she went a couple of weeks recently without her food stamp benefits, and then she went months without her cash welfare benefits. And that for her is missed meals, and then the missed cash is missed rent payments, and she had to go to her family who also don't have many resources and ask to borrow money. So that's, I think, a very typical story where maybe you get on in a couple weeks, maybe you get back on in a couple months, but that's pretty dire for someone who doesn't have a lot of cushion to fall back on. And that actually comes at a huge cost because they later get back on, usually, hopefully.
That to reapply.
Right. But then a caseworker has to, first of all, take them off and then put them back on, and they have to go through that whole system again. Whereas if they had just gotten through the first time around with the first round of paperwork, everyone would have been saved a lot of time and hassle. So it's a really big problem for the state, for that outlay of resources. They were able to calculate what that actually costs in dollars. In Illinois, for example, it was $3.9 million a year, and that's a net cost. Because while the state saved some money perhaps by some people losing benefits and then walking away, or maybe they really weren't eligible anymore, the cost to actually get everybody back on who was in fact still eligible was far more than what was saved by kicking some people off. And then, of course, it's a huge problem for people with constantly losing access to things that keep them alive. Food, health insurance, housing subsidies. You know, these are really basic things that people need for survival that they're losing here and there because of paperwork hassles.
All right, so they come in and they set up a system where all the people who are on food assistance, when the deadline is coming up, they get a text.
Right.
And what does the text say? Like, how does sending out a text suddenly make it much easier for somebody to renew?
Every little piece of this process took a lot of work. And that was what was so fascinating about watching it firsthand, is that it's a small thing, right? Just sending a text to remind to renew. And yet it took months of work, a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and something as small as a text message. You know, you don't have a lot of space. So every single word counts. And they also really thought very intentionally about every one of those words. You know, do Connecticut residents call it food stamps? Do they call it SNAP? Do they call it EBT, which is like a little bit outdated? Do they call it the Connecticut Department of Social Services? Do they call it DSS? Can the text message be sent from a short code, or will people think that's a scam? So they worked on every little bit of this. You know, it was down to the wire. Right before they were supposed to send the text, there was a question of, is this comma in the message going to screw up the URL? So they had to move a comma. You know, they were really fine-tuning it. But in the end, the message basically said, you know, dear first name, and it included the last four numbers of their case ID so that it would look less scammy. Your benefits are about to expire. You need to renew. I'm paraphrasing because, you know, they had the language really exact. By January 20th, you need to go here to update, or you need to send in your form by mail. And then it also included, if you want to opt out, text, I think it was stop snap opt-out or something like that, because they didn't want people, when they texted back stop, to be unable to be contacted by the Department of Social Services ever again about anything else.
So when they got this text and it had the link, and you click on the link, where did the link take you?
It took you to the Department of Social Services website. They do have a website in Connecticut where you can renew online. Not every state has the capabilities to do that. And in fact, Code for America's next project is they want to help make that website work even better. But yeah, it just took you straight to the website where you would have to renew anyway, and was sort of, again, prompting people to do it digitally instead of go back to the mailing and the paperwork.
Well, what about people, especially older people who may not have smartphones or don't have internet connection or don't use a laptop? Is there a way that those people are able to be reached?
It's going to be harder to reach them, certainly with this. They did do some research, and the vast majority of low-income households in the state do have cell phone numbers. Low-income people do tend to access the internet on a phone, so they're more likely to be able to get a text message, whereas if you're trying to reach people by mail, they tend to move around a lot, and their physical address actually changes quite frequently. So it may be a better way to reach folks. But this is definitely not going to reach everyone, and in particular, people who are not tech-savvy, who do not have a phone, perhaps older people. This is not something that's going to reach them or help them necessarily. So the Department of Social Services is definitely going to need to think of other ways to be in touch with people as well.
After the break, how is this texting program in Connecticut working out? You talked about how they really sweated over the link, what the link should look like and what those texts should say. So how do they overcome that skepticism that we all have now, that everything we get from someone we don't know is bad?
It's a huge hurdle, and it's a real one. They did research talking to SNAP recipients themselves to try to answer this question, and I sat in on some of that. And everyone they talked to knew someone who had been subject to a scam and had lost money, a Social Security scam or a SNAP scam, over their texts. So this is really real, and people have a right to be skeptical. And so what they did was they talked to people about, okay, what are the things that we could do that would signal to you that this is real? One of them was get the word out ahead of time. So in the paperwork that they send regularly, they include a little flyer that says, this is coming. You're going to get a text. It's going to look like this. It's going to be from this number. They did TV spots. They did radio spots. They did a press release. They did social media. So they got the word out. And then the other thing they did was they were really intentional about what the text looked like. One big thing that really came up in the research they did with SNAP recipients was that if it came from a random number or a 5-digit short code, that was going to look like a scam. But everyone felt comfortable having it come from the Department of Social Services call center number because they knew that number. Often it was already in their phone. They called it a lot. That was something they knew. So they said, okay, if it comes from that, I'll be fine. Another thing was if it has part of their client ID, that's a number that no one else should have. A scammer or a hacker shouldn't have. So there were these things that they could do to sort of signal to them, this is real. This is coming from a department you already know. But it is a risk. I'm sure they weren't able to eliminate skepticism entirely. One person said, this text message idea is great, and if I get it, I will probably trust it, but I will still go to a library computer and I will type it in manually just to be sure.
How were they able to make sure that all that pretty sensitive private information was going to be safe when they contracted out to a nonprofit?
That is, I think, a concern that comes up a lot for Code for America in this project and all others, because governments are tasked with having and keeping your very, very personal data and promising to keep it secure. And so I think there's a lot of discomfort around allowing an outside entity to have access to it. So one thing is just that Code for America has protocols and practices that it has in place that it has used with other states. And it was able to say to Connecticut, for example, this is what we do. This is what we've done. It has worked. We can vouch for it. But on top of that, Code for America, anyone who was going to be working with the data that they needed to send text messages had to have a background check. There are some extra sort of bureaucratic hurdles that they had to step through to make sure that they were going to be able to be trusted with this highly sensitive data.
So this kind of sounds like less a question of technology, because this is some pretty low-tech stuff, as it is a matter of just will to be able to do this. Do states just make this really, really hard?
Yes and no. I think to some extent, there are a lot of states that want to do better, and it's a question of resources. To some extent, it is a question of technology. Like, yes, these are not really high-flying projects, but it does require a brand new system to send texts when you've never sent a text message to someone before. And state agencies are really starved for resources. The workforces that take care of giving out benefits, of reviewing applications, they just are chronically underfunded. So if you spend money and time on something like text messages, you're taking it away from something else. But I will also say that the hurdles that poor people are confronted with when they go to apply for these benefits are sometimes intentional. It is a way to whittle down the rolls when you just make it harder and harder for people to access benefits. And we tend to see more of those hurdles in states, for example, with higher Black populations. So it's this legacy of sort of viewing the poor as perhaps undeserving or needing to work harder for the assistance that they qualify for.
They put this system in place to send all these texts to people in Connecticut when it was time to renew their benefits. Did it work? Was it successful?
Yeah, I got to watch the day they deployed the pilot, and the texts went out extremely quickly and cost less than $4 total.
And how many texts did they send out?
That first day, they sent about 10,000 texts, and the plan was to keep ramping it up. But it is reaching people, and they're evaluating the impact, but it seemed preliminarily that they were seeing less churn. They were not overwhelming the field offices with calls from recipients who were confused or scared by these texts. And they were also driving traffic to the Department of Social Services website. So the preliminary results looked really good. They were getting a lot of texts back from people saying, "Thank you, this is great." And, I think they're going to keep evaluating the impact and seeing if they can keep expanding it to other uses.
And what did the state of Connecticut pay Code for America to do this for them?
They paid them nothing.
So where does the funding for Code for America come from? How do they pay their staff?
They have philanthropic funding, and they just got this big infusion of funding to start what they're calling the Safety Net Innovation Lab. And so this Connecticut partnership is part of that lab. And the goal is both to work with more states. Eventually, they hope to have 15 states in this innovation lab with them, but also I think to do it on a longer time frame. Most of their projects before this tended to be come in and sort of fix a problem and then walk away. And in Connecticut, for example, they started with this texting pilot, which was pretty small, and then they wanted to expand texting. And then, like I said, ultimately, the goal is to redo the whole process entirely, the Department of Social Services website and how people interact with it, how easy it is to navigate, how easy it is to complete things online. So it's a bigger project and a longer-term project, I think, than they've normally been able to take on. Interestingly, though, it's not really a blue state or a red state thing so far. They've done a lot of work with the state of Louisiana, which has been really interested in making benefit delivery better. So I think that this is the kind of work that can attract people from all political persuasions. But there is a bit of a hurdle for some state governments in that while Code for America does not charge anything, you do have to invest staff time, and that is a resource, and it's a limited resource when funding is so low for state government agencies. So I think they would love to work with every single state government, but there may be some that just feel like they can't really swing it.
Bryce, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
When we come back, how receptive are states to the kind of help Code for America is offering? Now let's hear what it's actually like to do this kind of work. Genevieve Miller is Program Manager for Insight and Impact at Code for America. Genevieve, can you start by telling us, how does Code for America choose projects? Like, how do you decide who you're going to work with?
Code for America is a civic tech nonprofit. So that phrase civic tech may or may not be something listeners are familiar with, but what that essentially means is that we're driven by a core belief, which is that with the mindful use of technology, government can work well for everyone. And so for more than a decade, we've been working shoulder to shoulder with governments and communities across the country to make government services more accessible and equitable. We've worked with a wide range of states up until this point, and now our work with Connecticut is part of something called the Safety Net Innovation Lab. This is something that we launched last year with the goal of working with 15 states over 7 years to reach 13 million people and unlock $30 billion in benefits. And so that's a lot of numbers. But another way of articulating that vision is that we're working to transform the social safety net by using human-centered technology to remove barriers to public benefits. And it's really both as simple and as complex as that. Alongside Connecticut, we are also working with Louisiana, Minnesota, Colorado, and California. And then we recently announced and are in the process of kicking off work with New York, New Mexico, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. as part of the second cohort. We, as part of the Innovation Lab in particular, we kind of shared this opportunity publicly, and states actually reached out to us.
And so you are working on this project to make it easier for people to renew benefits that would expire otherwise. So when you move in to a project, here's this need. How do you go about figuring out what to do from like a tech standpoint?
With the recent end of the public health emergency and unwinding of Medicaid, we're really seeing that renewing benefits is particularly challenging right now for both clients and government partners. This is true in Connecticut and across the country.
How did you zero in on simple text message as being the best way to reach people?
Government services are at their best when they meet people where they're at and center those who are often excluded. And we know from our previous work in other states and now in Connecticut that texting is one of the most effective and equitable tools to do so. Texts are relatively affordable to send, especially when you compare it to sending, for example, paper notices in the mail. Client phone numbers are also less likely to change than their physical address, which makes texting a more consistently reliable way of reaching people. And most importantly, texts provide really timely information to support clients every step of the way.
What does Code for America see as like this next needed step in making public benefits more accessible so you don't just lose them if you forget to renew?
Well, I think what we learned from our pilot thus far in Connecticut, and what we've learned certainly in our texting work in other states as well, is that texts are a part of a much larger puzzle when it comes to supporting clients all the way from accessing benefits from the first time to renewing and maintaining their benefits. And so texts can provide timely information and resources for clients. However, there are still a lot of other steps in the process and kind of barriers that clients need to overcome when it comes to pulling together the documents that are needed or attending an interview and kind of scheduling that. And there are all of these pieces to the process. And so what's been really wonderful about this process and working with the Department of Social Services is that we're hearing from clients who are replying to our texts and we're hearing the questions that they're asking. And so when we remind clients to renew, for example, they may have a lot of follow-up questions around what's required of them and some of those next steps. And so we're continuing to have conversations with the Department of Social Services around other things that we're hearing from clients about.
Genevieve, we've mostly been talking about this specific program in Connecticut, but you mentioned other states that Code for America is also working in. What are you doing in those places? What other projects do you have in the works?
Other states are looking at increasing participation for the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, often referred to as WIC. And other states are focused on projects related to Medicaid and really improving single integrated benefits applications. And so there's a lot of different projects that are within the Innovation Lab. And so we're sharing a lot of learnings as part of that process. And actually a really core part of the Innovation Lab for states is that they're doing this in cohorts. So they have the opportunity to, on a monthly basis, come together and really learn from each other, hear what everyone is working on. And I think really importantly to share the challenges they're facing, the dreams that they have for their clients and their staff. And we've seen just an incredible space held for those conversations. And so they're doing a lot of learning together, even if their specific projects might look different.
Genevieve, thanks so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to us here at The Big Take. It's a daily podcast from Bloomberg and iHeartRadio. For more shows from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. And we'd love to hear from you. Email us questions or comments to bigtake@bloomberg.net. The supervising producer of The Big Take is Vicky Vergolina. Our senior producer is Catherine Fink. Rebecca Chasson is our producer. Our associate producer is Sam Gebauer. Hilda Garcia is our engineer. Our original music was composed by Leo Sidran. I'm Wes Kosova. We'll be back tomorrow with another Big Take.